Thanks for joining us. This is the third in a four-part series based on a web briefing originally delivered in August 2013 as part of our summer school for records coordinators. We started by looking at what a records inventory is and why you would conduct one. Then we talked about planning for an inventory. In this episode, we'll look at different ways to approach the inventory, and we'll look at some examples of the kinds of information you might collect. You can approach a record series inventory in a number of different ways. The method you choose will depend a lot on the goals, scope, time frame, and resources available for your project. Let's take a quick look at some of the more common approaches. Before you begin a new inventory, be sure to identify any work that's already been done. Did your records program do an inventory a couple of years ago? If so, you may find that you just need to update that information. You can also look for information that was gathered for other purposes, like System of Records notices for systems that collect personal data. Those existing system inventories and notices can help you identify key databases and other information sources that are supporting your agency's work. They'll often tell you the main purpose of the system, the types of information it contains, the program points of contact, and how the information is used. Your information technology department is a great resource for this kind of information. Any enterprise architecture work they've done, and the IT planning and budget information they collect, like the Exhibit 300 or other planning documents, can really help you identify and examine systems from a records management perspective. Your server team may have tools that can help you analyze company shared drives and help you understand what kinds of electronic files are stored where and by whom. Don't be afraid to reach out to your IT department. Records management and IT are natural partners when it comes to information management, and our programs can work together as a good team. Process maps and context diagrams are another helpful way to identify records and understand how the information supports your business. These make great collaboration tools when you're talking with subject matter experts. If your agency's done work in Lean Six Sigma or other types of process improvement, you may already have access to diagrams like these. Here's an example. In process mapping, you look at each step in a business process and examine how the work flows throughout that process. We would use this map or create one like it as we talk with the safety testing department to find out what they do when they inspect a playground. As we identify the steps, we also identify the information resources, the records, systems, and other information that the expert uses in each step along the way. This approach is really helpful when you're doing a vital records inventory as part of your business continuity and disaster recovery planning. You can see what work needs to be done and what information is needed at each point along the way. When you've analyzed the process, you have a list of potential records and systems, and you have a better understanding of how they fit together to support the work. I saw a related approach at a presentation at the 2007 ARMA International Conference. The speaker used context diagrams to identify the key stakeholders in a process and identify what information flows into and out of that process. In the context diagram approach, you're not concerned so much with the steps of the process. You're focusing instead on who's involved and what information they get from or give to the process. You start by putting the process in the middle, then adding the major players around that circle. Then you identify the types of information and show those flowing into or out of the work being done. This can be a quick graphical way to identify and represent that information while you're working with experts who understand the process. There are several traditional ways to approach a records inventory. You can distribute questionnaires or surveys to each department and ask a point of contact to collect the information and send it back to you. This allows you to use the expertise and the effort of the people in the departments that hold the records. It can be a quick initial approach that helps you gather information in a shorter period of time. There are some negatives here, though. As anyone who's ever done a survey knows, people don't always respond, and sometimes the information you get is not as complete or accurate as you'd like. If you're going to use this approach, be very clear about what you mean, what information you want, and by when. The interview method allows you to gather more in-depth information in a one-on-one or small group setting. It allows you to talk with people about their work, and it gives you a chance to ask for clarification or ask follow-up questions. I always recommend that you work from a standard list of questions that you've created ahead of time, and I recommend that you focus the interview on the work process that's supported by the records. That allows you to see the records in context with the work being done. The process and context mapping techniques work well when combined with an interview. You'll need to be careful to stay on track and take good, clear notes so you can compile and analyze the information later. These techniques can also be used together, so you might start with a questionnaire and then follow up with interviews for those new or unusual record types. A physical site visit or site survey means that you or someone from your team actually goes out and looks at the records. Again, this approach can be combined with questionnaires and interviews or other techniques. It often results in more accurate, more complete information because your team can examine the records and see exactly what's going on. A visit can also be a good opportunity to connect, and you may find that you're able to answer questions or help resolve other records issues while you're there. This does tend to be the most time-consuming and labor-intensive approach for your team, but depending on the nature of the records and the goals of your inventory, it may yield the best results. I prefer a combination approach that's tailored to the goals, scope, and needs of the inventory. I might start with a very basic questionnaire, then do some follow-up interviews where we need more information, and then visit just a few departments when we find we need even more detail. Or you could start with an interview that creates or reviews process maps, then follows up with the group by sending them a spreadsheet or other document showing all the record types the group identified so they can review and confirm what you found. And from there you do more in-depth interviews or visits as needed. If you already have a fairly recent inventory, you might just be asking people to confirm or update existing information, and then do follow-up interviews or visits in the few cases where those are needed. As you choose how to inventory, you'll also need to decide what to collect. The type of information you gather in your records inventory really depends on your goals, your scope, and your situation. I'll give you some more common examples in this segment. As we go along, start thinking about the types of data you will need to collect for your inventory. We can compare notes at the end. Here's our scenario from the previous segment. In this example, our main goal for the baseline inventory is to gather the information we need to re-establish a records management program. So we want to use the data we gather to see what records we currently have, where they're stored, and in what formats. We also want to see if we have any new types of records or any records whose current schedules need to be updated. Along the way, an inventory might help us identify record-keeping issues or opportunities for improvement, and that could help us plan for our program. Ultimately, we'd like to prepare file plans for our 3 locations so people in each office know what information is stored and where. There are some general categories of information that we typically collect as part of a record series inventory. We'll look at examples in each of these broad categories. If you're conducting your inventory with help from anyone, a small team or a large one, you'll want to identify the person who did each part of the inventory. You'll also want to identify which department, program, or office owns the records and capture the name of the point of contact for the records. As you collect more and more inventory data, you may find that you need to go back for clarification or for some more information, so this contact information can be important. Information about the records is, of course, the heart and soul of your inventory. You want to capture what each series, each type of records, is called. I like to note any additional names that are used, too, especially when I'm creating file plans. Is there an official name for the system, but people refer to it by an acronym or a system number? How do people ask for the records? You also want to capture a brief description of the series or system. What are these? What purpose do the records serve? What's included in this collection of records? In our example, we're looking at case files that support the playground safety testing process. Knowing that the files include photos, reports, and other materials will help us understand, capture, manage, and preserve the records. In most records inventories, we capture some basic information about how and where the files are maintained. If they're paper records, we note where they're stored, and if they're electronic, we note where they are on the network, who the system points of contact are, and things like that. We also note the date span of the records. This can help you be sure you've located all of the files. If you find 2000 through 2005 and 2010 to the present, you can see pretty quickly you still haven't found all the records. In a lot of cases, we'll note the volume of the records. That's usually recorded in cubic feet. One standard records box holds 1 cubic foot. If you have electronic files, you'll note the amount of space those files take on your network. This information is helpful if you're planning for record storage space, planning to send the files to a record center or an archives, planning to purchase data storage, or just trying to get a picture of the vast quantity of information your organization has. In our example, we're also tracking what, if any, record schedule covers the records. Since we want to prepare file plans and update schedules in this example, this is information that will help us move forward. If we find records that don't yet have a schedule, we can ask for recommendations for retention times. In this inventory, we're also going to collect information about the formats and media we use to store the records. This can help you identify areas where you may need to plan for preservation, storage, and other issues. In our example, we want to prepare file plans to help each department identify and retain their records. So part of our file plan will include information on how the records are to be organized. We're going to collect that information here. If you have the same type of records maintained in several different offices, asking this question can help you identify where you need to standardize things like naming and filing conventions. There are other bits of information you might also collect depending on the goals of your inventory. You could track whether there are any related indexes or finding aids for the records. In our example, how do they find the case numbers for each one? Are there other copies stored elsewhere? That's helpful to know if you're planning for disaster recovery or if you're planning to consolidate storage. Are there any other related records? If you're building a record schedule, you really want to know that so you can manage all the records in a coordinated way. If you're building or updating a record schedule or file plans, you also want to know when the files close. When's the work complete, and when do we stop adding new material to the file? You'll choose the information you need to meet the goals of your inventory. Some inventories will require less information, and some will need more. The information we gather for electronic systems is pretty similar. We ask questions like, what's the system called? Is it related to any other records or systems? What programs are supported by the system? That's critical information because you want to be sure that all the stakeholders' interests are included when you're building your schedule. Just like with traditional series, we also capture information about the business and technical points of contact for the system and information about how and where it's stored. We look at what information is stored in the system and how it's accessed. We look at what goes into the system and at what kinds of reports, data streams, or other products come out of the system and where they go when they're generated. We look at the electronic formats of the content and at the metadata. Metadata is that additional information about the records, things like dates, file titles, project numbers, the things we use to locate, manage, understand, and preserve the records. We look at what it takes to make up a complete record in the system, and we look at how the information flows through the system, what's its lifespan, and what happens to it. I've given you a lot of examples, and you'll want to tailor that list to fit your project. Whether your inventory is large or small, I recommend that you choose those data fields and prepare whatever tool you'll use to collect the data, a form, spreadsheet, database, or system, and test that out on a few series before you truly jump into the inventory project. Give the inventory tool to a couple of people who'll be working on your team and ask them to highlight any areas of confusion. Actually try out the form on a handful of record types and then look at the results. Are you getting the information you need in a way that'll work for you? As you get started, you'll also want to spot check the inventory results to make sure things are working the way you intended. The size and scope of your inventory will also determine what approach you take to collect the data. If it's a small project for one area with just a few types of records, you might do the inventory yourself with a notepad and a pencil. If it's a larger effort, you'll want to look for the best way to capture the information as it comes in. Are you going to ask for handwritten or electronic forms that you consolidate into a single spreadsheet or database? If you're doing inventories, how will you transcribe those notes into a form that allows you to compile the information? If it's a very large effort across many offices and locations, you may want to consider having some kind of data entry tool that allows your team to capture what they find in one central location. Data collection does not have to be fancy, it just needs to be effective. Choose the approach that'll help you meet the goals of your project in the simplest way. If you're inventorying paper and other physical formats, you may want to map their locations as you capture their descriptions. One of my colleagues recommends taking a sheet of paper and sketching out the locations of cabinets, shelves, and other record storage areas when you're doing a site visit or a physical inventory. You can then note the location of each series as you find it. This will help refresh your memory, and it can help as you're preparing vital records plans or planning to consolidate files. You can also note any problems you find during the inventory so those can be corrected. After you and your team have carried out the inventory, it's time to put your data to work. In the next segment, we'll look at what to do after you've collected your data.